You've been taught the wrong history of love. Not lied to, exactly. Just given half the story. Because long before anyone coined the word homosexual, entire civilizations were already writing love poems to the same sex, building military units around it, carving it into tomb walls, and in at least one case, turning a dead lover into a god. This isn't a modern debate dressed up in old costumes. This is thousands of years of documented human behavior, hiding in plain sight in the historical record. You just weren't handed the footnotes. Start in Egypt, almost 4,500 years ago. In a tomb near Saqqara, archaeologists found the burial of two men named Niankkhnum and Khnumhotep. They were both royal manicurists, high-status men serving the pharaoh's court. Their tomb shows them embracing nose to nose, in the exact pose Egyptian art reserved for married couples. Their families appear in the background, almost as an afterthought, the way you'd expect wives to appear beside a husband elsewhere in Egyptian funerary art. Egyptologists have argued for decades about how to interpret this. Some insist the men were simply brothers. Others point out that nothing else in 4,000 years of Egyptian tomb art shows brothers embracing like that. The pose was reserved for spouses. Whatever the truth, the tomb itself proves something simple. Same-sex intimacy, at the very least same-sex devotion, intense enough to be memorialized for eternity, was not unthinkable to the people who built the pyramids. Move forward 2,000 years into classical Greece, and the evidence stops being ambiguous at all. In Athens, a grown citizen man was expected, at some point in his life, to form an intense romantic and often sexual bond with a younger man. Historians call this pederasty, and it wasn't hidden in back rooms. It was painted on wine cups. It was joked about in comic plays. It was argued over in courts of law. The classicist Kenneth Dover spent years cataloging this evidence, reading through hundreds of vase paintings and legal speeches to reconstruct what Athenians genuinely believed about desire. What he found reshapes the whole question. Athenians didn't organize sexuality around the gender of your partner. They organized it around status and role. Who held the power in the relationship? Who was the pursuer and who was pursued? A citizen man could take male and female lovers across his lifetime and never think of himself as belonging to a sexual category at all, because in his mind, no such category existed. The historian David Halperin has argued that the entire concept of sexual orientation as a fixed personal identity would have struck an ancient Athenian as a strange, almost meaningless question. Sparta and Thebes pushed this even further into the machinery of war itself. Spartan military training paired experienced soldiers with younger recruits in bonds that were openly romantic, on the theory that a man fights harder to protect someone he loves. Thebes turned that theory into policy. In 378 BCE, the city formed an elite infantry unit made entirely of male couples, 150 pairs, 150 lovers standing shoulder to shoulder in the battle line. It was called the Sacred Band, and for nearly 4 decades it was considered unbeatable. Ancient historians claim the soldiers fought with a ferocity ordinary units couldn't match, because retreating would mean abandoning the person they loved most in the world standing right beside them. An army, engineered on purpose around same-sex devotion, because a general calculated it would win more battles. It did, until Philip II of Macedon finally destroyed it at Cheronea in 338 BCE, and even Philip, according to ancient accounts, wept when he saw how the men had died, still in formation, side by side. Now sail out to the island of Lesbos in the 6th century BCE and meet the poet Sappho. Sappho ran a community of young women, and she wrote some of the most intimate verses to survive from the ancient world, most of them addressed to women, aching with longing, jealousy, and physical desire. Her reputation was so powerful that centuries later the words lesbian and sapphic were coined directly from her name and her island. For most of antiquity, nobody treated her poetry as scandalous. It was celebrated, studied, imitated. It was only in far later, more restrictive eras that scholars scrambled to explain her words away. The historian Bernadette Bruton spent years researching female homoeroticism across the ancient Mediterranean world and found evidence of women's same-sex relationships documented, discussed, and in some communities even ritually recognized, far more often than earlier generations of historians had assumed. The erasure came later, the evidence came first. Head east now into the Persian and later Islamic world, where the tradition never fully disappeared, even under religious restriction. Centuries after the rise of Islam, the poet Abu Nuwas, working in the court of Baghdad in the 8th century, wrote openly homoerotic verse describing wine, taverns, and beautiful young men, and his poetry was popular enough to survive in manuscript collections copied and recopied for 1,000 years. This wasn't an underground scandal, it was celebrated court literature, part of a broader tradition in Persian and Arabic poetry where the beloved being addressed was frequently male, and readers understood exactly what was meant. Cross the continent into Han Dynasty China around the 1st century BCE, and you find the story of Emperor Ai and a court official named Dong Xian. According to the histories, the emperor woke one afternoon to find his own sleeve trapped beneath his sleeping companion. Rather than disturb him, he cut the sleeve off. From that single act came an entire poetic tradition. For centuries afterward, Chinese literature referred to same-sex love using the phrase, the passion of the cut sleeve. It wasn't coded slang whispered in secret corners. It was elegant literary shorthand, used openly by poets who assumed their readers would understand the reference immediately. Rome tells a rougher version of the same story. Roman culture, like Greek culture, cared less about the gender of your partner and more about your role in the act itself. A freeborn Roman man having sex with another man carried no automatic shame, as long as he was the dominant partner and his partner held lower status, an enslaved person or a foreigner. But if a citizen was the passive partner, his reputation could be permanently damaged. The Emperor Hadrian shattered every unspoken rule about how public devotion like this should stay. His companion, a young man named Antinous, drowned in the Nile in 130 CE. And Hadrian's grief was so overwhelming, so completely public, that he founded an entire city in Antinous' honor, commissioned statues of him across the empire, and had him formally declared a god. Some of those statues survive today. You can walk through museums in Europe and stand face to face with a young man an emperor once loved enough to reshape imperial religion around his memory. Now travel to feudal Japan, and you find same-sex love written directly into the code of the samurai class. The tradition was called wakashudo, or the way of the youth, and it paired an older warrior with a younger apprentice in a bond that was both educational and romantic. Similar in structure to Greek pederasty, but developed completely independently, thousands of miles away, with no historical contact between the two cultures. That independence matters. Two civilizations, isolated from each other by an ocean and a continent, arrived at strikingly similar frameworks for organizing same-sex mentorship and desire. South Asia carved its own version of this history directly into stone. At the temple complex of Khajuraho, built in central India between the 10th and 12th centuries, sculptors covered the outer walls with intricate carvings of sexual acts, including same-sex encounters, positioned alongside scenes of daily life, warfare, and worship. Scholars still debate the exact purpose of these carvings, some tied to tantric philosophy, some to a broader Hindu comfort with depicting the full range of human desire as part of a complete life. Centuries earlier, The Kama Sutra itself, compiled by Vatsyayana sometime around the 3rd century CE, included a section describing sexual relationships between men, discussing preferences and techniques with the same clinical tone it used for every other kind of pairing. It wasn't hidden in an appendix, it was simply one more category of human intimacy the text considered worth explaining. And it wasn't only warrior elites, poets, or temple sculptors. Anthropologists studying indigenous cultures across North America documented a recurring pattern they eventually grouped under the term two-spirit, describing people who occupied gender and sexual roles that didn't map onto a simple binary at all. Among many nations, these individuals weren't just tolerated, they frequently held specific ceremonial responsibilities, acted as healers or mediators, and were understood to carry a kind of dual perspective unavailable to anyone else in the community. Their relationships with people of the same sex weren't treated as a deviation from the norm. They were treated as one recognized part of it. In the 20th century, the anthropologist Gilbert Hurt documented ritualized same-sex relationships among the Sambia people of Papua New Guinea, structured around a strict belief that boys required the transmission of masculinity through older men before they could safely marry women themselves. It's a system almost nothing like Greek pederasty on the surface, and yet it emerges from a strangely similar underlying logic. The idea that masculinity itself needed to be built deliberately by other men. So why does all of this feel hidden from the version of history you were actually taught? Part of the answer is translation. For centuries, European scholars rendering Greek and Roman texts into English quietly softened or erased the same-sex content, swapping pronouns, cutting whole passages, or adding footnotes insisting readers shouldn't take the words too literally. The historian John Boswell spent much of his career tracing exactly this pattern through medieval Christian sources, documenting how later church authorities reinterpreted or suppressed earlier traditions that had been considerably more permissive than the centuries that followed them. Another part of the answer is that different cultures organize sexuality around entirely different questions. Some asked who held power, some asked what role you played, some asked whether masculinity itself needed to be ritually built. None of these systems match the checkbox on a modern intake form, because none of them were built by people trying to answer the question you were raised to ask. And maybe that's the real reframe here. You tend to think of sexual identity as a fixed truth, waiting to be discovered. The same in every era, simply suppressed or expressed depending on how open a given society happened to be. But the historical record suggests something messier, and honestly, more interesting. Desire between men and desire between women has left evidence in tomb paintings, court poetry, military records, legal speeches, and grieving emperors. Across 5 continents and 4,000 years of unrelated cultures that never once spoke to each other. What changes, generation to generation, empire to empire, isn't whether the desire exists. What changes is the framework people build around it to explain it to themselves. The Egyptians built theirs around eternal companionship. The Greeks built theirs around status and role. The Romans built theirs around power and penetration. The Chinese court built theirs around loyalty and poetry. The Japanese warrior class built theirs around apprenticeship. Communities across North America and the Pacific built theirs around ritual and the sacred. You inherited yours, built mostly in the last 150 years, organized around orientation as a fixed personal identity. None of these frameworks is the natural one, sitting underneath all the others like bedrock. They're all just different lenses, invented by different societies, trying to make sense of something that has apparently always been part of being human. It's worth sitting with how strange that makes your own assumptions look. You probably grew up believing that the way your culture currently talks about sexuality is the neutral, default setting, and that every other framework, ancient or modern, is some kind of variation on it. The evidence points the other way. Your framework is the variation. It's a recent, specific, historically unusual way of sorting desire, no more natural than an Athenian sorting by status, or a Roman sorting by role, or a Sambia elder sorting by ritual stage of life. Every one of those systems felt like simple common sense to the people living inside it. Every one of them would have seemed just as arbitrary and confusing to an outsider as yours might seem to them. That doesn't mean none of it mattered, or that people didn't suffer under some of these systems too. Status hierarchies could be brutal. Ritual expectations could be rigid. None of this is a simple story where the ancient world was uniformly more accepting than the present. It's a more complicated story, where nearly every documented human civilization, independently, repeatedly, across oceans and centuries with no contact between them, found some way to make room for desire between people of the same sex, even while wrapping very different rules and very different pressures around it. So the next time you check a box on a form, remember what you're actually doing. You're not describing something ancient humans would recognize as a category at all. You're using one framework among dozens documented across recorded history, invented by people trying, like every generation before them, to put language around a feeling that has never once needed permission to exist. Like and subscribe for more stories like this.